The House of Stuart did not lose the British crown in a single night. It lost it slowly, violently, and almost always by misunderstanding the world that was changing around it. At its height, this family held the crowns of Scotland, England, and Ireland. Its kings claimed ancient blood, sacred authority, and the right to rule by inheritance. They sat on thrones surrounded by ceremony, bishops, nobles, soldiers, and symbols of divine power. To the Stuarts, monarchy was not simply government. It was order itself. A king was not merely a political leader. He was God's chosen ruler, the living center of the kingdom. But the age they entered was no longer willing to accept that without question. Across Britain, power was moving. Parliament was becoming harder to ignore. Religion was dividing communities. Merchants and landowners wanted stability, law, and influence. Soldiers were learning that loyalty could be given to causes, not just crowns. Ordinary people were beginning to see that kings could be challenged, resisted, and, in the most shocking moment of all, judged. This was the tragedy of the Stuarts. They inherited crowns, but they struggled to earn trust. Their story is filled with some of the most dramatic figures in royal history. Mary, Queen of Scots, beautiful, Catholic, and dangerous, became a prisoner before she became a martyr. Her son, James Veers of Scotland, inherited the English throne and seemed to fulfill a dynastic dream by uniting two ancient crowns. His son, Charles I, believed so deeply in royal authority that he led his kingdoms into civil war rather than surrender the dignity of kingship. And then the unthinkable happened. A Stuart king was placed on trial by his own subjects. Charles I, the anointed monarch of England, Scotland, and Ireland, was accused of tyranny and treason. In January 1649, he walked onto a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The axe fell, and with it fell the sacred illusion that a king's body was untouchable. For monarchs across Europe, it was a nightmare. For the Stuarts, it was a wound that would never fully heal. Yet even after that disaster, the family returned. Charles II came back from exile in 1660, smiling, charming, and careful. London celebrated, the theatres reopened. The royal court glittered again. The monarchy had been restored, but something essential had changed. The Stuarts were back on the throne only because the political nation had allowed them to return. The crown had survived, but it was no longer unquestioned. Charles II understood this better than most of his family. He bent when he needed to bend. He hid his deeper instincts when survival demanded it. But his brother James II did not inherit the same caution. A Catholic king in a fearful Protestant kingdom, James reignited every suspicion that had once destroyed the dynasty. Within 3 years, he was abandoned by political elites, deserted by soldiers, and forced into exile as his own daughter and son-in-law took the crown. This was not merely a family quarrel. It was a revolution in the meaning of monarchy. By the time Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, came to the throne, the old dream was nearly finished. Britain was becoming a constitutional state. Parliament was stronger. The succession was controlled by law. The monarchy remained, but the Stuarts themselves were running out of heirs, time, and political possibility. When Anne died in 1714, the crown passed away from the family forever. The exiled Stuarts still dreamed of return. Their supporters, the Jacobites, raised banners, fought battles, and sang songs for the lost kings across the water. But romance could not reverse history. The world that had made the Stuarts royal had vanished. This is the story of a dynasty that rose through blood, marriage, faith, and inheritance, only to discover that a crown is not enough. The Stuarts did not fall because they lacked drama, courage, or royal blood. They fell because they believed power came from God, while Britain was learning that power also required consent. To understand how they lost the British crown, we must begin where their instincts were formed, on Scotland's dangerous throne. Scotland did not give the Stuarts an easy throne. It gave them a crown that looked ancient, but dangerous from the moment anyone tried to wear it. Long before the family ruled England, the Stuarts learned kingship in a harder school. Scotland was a kingdom of fierce nobles, regional loyalties, border violence, clan rivalries, and constant pressure from larger powers. A Scottish king could claim sacred authority, but authority meant little if the great lords refused to obey. The crown existed, but power was scattered across castles, families, and factions that could make or break a monarch. The Stuarts rose from this world not as untouched rulers above politics, but as players inside it. Their name came from the office of High Steward of Scotland, a position that placed the family close to royal power before it placed them on the throne. Through marriage into the royal line, they gained what every ambitious noble house wanted, a claim that could become a crown. In 1371, Robert II became the first Stuart King of Scotland. His accession began a dynasty that would last for centuries, but from the beginning, the family's rule was shaped by instability. The Scottish throne was prestigious, yet never fully secure. Kings had to manage noble families who were often wealthy enough, armed enough, and proud enough to resist them. They had to balance alliances with France against hostility from England. They had to survive in a kingdom where loyalty could change quickly, and where a ruler who appeared weak might find himself surrounded by men eager to control him. This early Scottish world is essential to understanding the later Stuarts. They did not inherit the calm confidence of monarchs whose commands were automatically obeyed. They inherited the anxiety of rulers who knew that a crown could be challenged. Again and again, Scottish kings found themselves trapped between royal ambition and aristocratic power. Some were killed, some were dominated. Some spent their reigns trying to pull authority back from nobles who had grown too strong. That struggle created a deep Stuart hunger for stronger monarchy. To their supporters, this desire was understandable. A king who could not command his nobles could not protect the kingdom. A crown without authority was only decoration. But to their enemies, the same desire looked like arrogance. The Stuarts wanted obedience because they had seen what happened when kings did not get it. This is the contrast at the heart of their dynasty's survival, taught them to crave control, but control would later make them dangerous. The Scottish throne also placed the Stuarts inside the religious and diplomatic storms of Europe. Scotland's old alliance with France pulled the kingdom toward Catholic continental politics, while its rivalry with England made every royal marriage, treaty, and succession question part of a larger struggle. The Reformation would make this even more explosive. Religion was no longer just private belief. It became a test of loyalty, identity, and political legitimacy. For the Stuarts, bloodline was both a gift and a burden. Royal descent gave them claims, marriages, and prestige, but it also placed them under constant scrutiny. A royal child was never just a child. A marriage was never just a marriage. A king's faith was never just a matter of conscience. Everything personal became political, because the dynasty itself was the state. By the 16th century, the Stuarts had learned the oldest lesson of monarchy. Legitimacy could place a crown on your head, but it could not force men to deal. Nobles might swear loyalty in public and plot in private. Foreign courts might offer friendship while seeking advantage. Religious reformers might claim obedience to God above obedience to kings. This was the dangerous inheritance the family carried forward. When the Stuarts reached the English throne, they brought with them the memory of Scottish disorder and the instinct to defend royal authority. But England was not Scotland. Its parliament was stronger, its political expectations different, and its suspicion of unchecked monarchy deepening. Before that conflict reached London, however, the dynasty would produce one of its most tragic figures, a queen raised for greatness, surrounded by enemies, and destroyed by the bloodline that made her powerful. Mary, Queen of Scots, was born with the kind of bloodline that could open thrones and invite death. From her first days, she was not simply a child. She was a claim, a symbol, and a danger. Her father, James V of Scotland, died when she was only days old, leaving an infant girl as queen in a kingdom already divided by noble ambition and foreign pressure. Scotland did not receive her as a peaceful blessing. It received her as a prize. To Catholic Europe, Mary represented dynastic possibility. To Protestant reformers, she would become a threat. To England, she was never just Scotland's queen. Through Tudor blood, she also carried a claim to the English throne, especially in the eyes of those who rejected Elizabeth as illegitimate. That claim made her powerful before she could speak, and dangerous before she could rule. For safety, Mary was sent to France, where she grew up surrounded by ceremony, refinement, and Catholic grandeur. She was educated, admired, and prepared for a glittering future. When she married the French Dauphin, she seemed destined to become one of the most important queens in Europe. For a brief moment, her life looked like triumph: Queen of Scotland by birth, Queen of France by marriage, and possible heir to England by blood. But the same connections that made her extraordinary also made her vulnerable. Her young husband, Francis II, died after a short reign, and Mary returned to Scotland in 1561 as a widow barely out of childhood. The country she came back to was not the country she had left. The Protestant Reformation had transformed Scottish politics. Powerful nobles had grown accustomed to acting without her. Religious leaders viewed her Catholic faith with suspicion. The courtly world of France had taught her majesty, elegance, and ceremony. Scotland demanded caution, compromise, and survival. Mary possessed charm, intelligence, and courage, but she entered a kingdom where every decision could be used against her. Her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, seemed at first to strengthen her claim. He too had royal blood, and their union produced a son, the future James V. Yet the marriage quickly became a disaster. Darnley was vain, unstable, and resentful. The court turned poisonous. Violence moved from rumor to reality. The murder of Mary's secretary, David Rizzio, in front of the pregnant queen exposed how fragile her authority had become. Then came the death of Darnley himself, killed after an explosion at Kirkhoe Field in 1567. Suspicion fell across the court and soon across Mary. Whether she was directly involved remains one of history's enduring arguments, but politically the damage was immediate. Her next move made everything worse. Mary married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man many believed responsible for Darnley's death. To her defenders, she may have been coerced, trapped, or desperate. To her enemies, the marriage looked like proof of guilt. In politics, perception can be more lethal than truth. The queen, who had once seemed born for greatness, was now surrounded by rebellion. Scottish nobles rose against her, forced her abdication, and placed her infant son on the throne. Mary escaped captivity and fled south to England, expecting royal protection from her cousin Elizabeth. Instead, she found a more elegant prison. For nearly 19 years, Mary lived in English custody. She was too royal to kill easily, too dangerous to free, and too useful for Catholic plots to ignore. Around her name gathered hopes, conspiracies, and fears. Elizabeth hesitated, but Mary's existence remained a living challenge to her throne. In 1587, after being implicated in the Babington plot, Mary was executed. She died not as a defeated politician, but as a Catholic martyr in the eyes of many supporters. Her final hours became part of the legend: dignity against humiliation, faith against fear, a queen without power still commanding the imagination of Europe. Her life revealed the fatal power of Stuart blood. It could make a child a queen, a widow a threat, and a prisoner more dangerous than an army. Mary lost her crown, but her son would inherit the future she never reached. With him, the Stuart story would move from tragedy to triumph. James Stuart inherited more than a crown from his mother. He inherited the consequences of her tragedy. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate in 1567, her infant son became James V of Scotland. He was a king before he understood what kingship meant. Around him stood nobles, regents, ministers, tutors, and religious leaders, each trying to shape the boy who carried the future of the Stuart dynasty. His mother was alive but imprisoned. His throne was real but controlled by others. His blood gave him legitimacy, but his childhood taught him that legitimacy alone was never enough. James grew up in a Scotland transformed by Protestant reform and noble rivalry. He was raised away from Mary's Catholic influence and educated as a Protestant ruler. His tutors filled him with learning, theology, classical history, and political theory. Unlike many kings remembered mainly for war or romance, James was deeply intellectual. He wrote, argued, debated, and thought seriously about monarchy. He did not merely want to be obeyed. He wanted to explain why kings should be obeyed. This made him different from his mother, but not free from her shadow. Mary's execution in 1587 could have destroyed relations between Scotland and England. Instead, James responded with caution. He protested, but he did not gamble away his future. He knew that Elizabeth I had no children, and that his own claim to the English throne was his greatest inheritance. His mother had been killed as a threat to Elizabeth. James would survive by becoming Elizabeth's heir. This was his great strength, patience. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the Tudor line ended, and James V of Scotland became James I of England. For the Stuarts, it was the moment Mary had never reached. A Scottish king rode south to inherit the richest and most powerful crown in the British Isles. The crowns of Scotland and England were now united on one head. It looked like destiny. James called himself King of Great Britain, imagining a deeper union between the two kingdoms. He wanted to turn old enemies into one political family. Scotland and England had fought, raided, negotiated, and feared each other for centuries. Now, through Stuart blood, they shared a monarch. But a shared king was not the same as a shared nation. England did not simply become comfortable with a Scottish ruler. James arrived with unfamiliar habits, favourites, accents, assumptions, and theories of kingship. Some English courtiers welcomed him. Others saw him as an outsider. Parliament accepted his legal claim, but it did not accept every royal ambition that came with it. James believed firmly in the divine right of kings. To him, monarchy was not a contract handed out by subjects. It was a sacred office ordained by God. Kings were fathers of their people, judges above factions, and guardians of order. This belief had been sharpened by his Scottish experience. He had seen what happened when nobles grew too powerful and ministers claimed too much authority. He wanted a monarchy that could stand above them. To his admirers, James was wise, learned, and peace-loving. He avoided the catastrophic wars that ruined other rulers. He sponsored the King James Bible, one of the most influential works in the English language. He helped keep his kingdoms largely stable after the uncertain end of the Tudor age. But to his critics, James talked too much about royal power and listened too little to political warning signs. He struggled with money. He clashed with Parliament. He angered Puritans who wanted deeper religious reform and disappointed Catholics who had hoped for greater toleration. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, a failed Catholic conspiracy to destroy king and Parliament, deepened Protestant fear and made religion even more explosive. James had united crowns, but not hearts, churches, or political expectations. His reign did not end in collapse. In many ways, that was his achievement. He managed tensions that would later destroy his son, but beneath the surface, the Stuart problem was already forming. The king believed monarchy should command respect because it was sacred. Many of his English subjects believed monarchy deserved respect only when it respected law, religion, and Parliament. James gave the Stuarts their greatest opportunity, a British future. But he also left them their most dangerous inheritance, the belief that a king's authority came from heaven, even when his kingdom was beginning to demand limits on earth. The Stuarts did not lose the crown only because of bad luck, weak heirs, or dangerous enemies. They lost it because they believed in a version of monarchy that Britain was beginning to outgrow. For James V and I, kingship was not a job given by subjects. It was a sacred office. A king did not rule because Parliament approved him, nobles liked him, or the public trusted him. He ruled because God had placed him above the kingdom. In this view, rebellion against a lawful king was not merely political disobedience, it was a sin against divine order. To James, this belief made perfect sense. He had grown up in Scotland, surrounded by nobles who challenged royal authority, churchmen who claimed moral power over kings, and factions that could turn a monarch into a prisoner of his own court. Divine right gave him a weapon against that chaos. It told the world that a king was more than the strongest noble in the room. He was the guardian of order itself. But England was not willing to accept royal authority without conditions. The English monarchy had always been powerful, but it had never existed entirely alone. Parliament mattered because kings needed money. Law mattered because subjects claimed ancient rights. Religion mattered because conscience could inspire obedience or rebellion. Landowners, merchants, lawyers, bishops, and nobles all believed they had a stake in how the kingdom was governed. This created the central Stuart contradiction. The king saw limits as threats to sacred authority. Many of his subjects saw limits as protection against tyranny. The issue was not simply whether James or his successors were good men. The issue was whether a king could govern as if his will stood above the political nation. Every dispute over taxation, religion, foreign policy, and royal favorites became part of a larger question: who had the right to decide the future of the kingdom? Money made the conflict unavoidable. Royal dignity required courts, officials, diplomacy, patronage, warships, ceremonies, and armies. But money often required Parliament. When Parliament granted taxation, it expected grievances to be heard. When kings asked for funds, members wanted answers. To the Stuarts, this could feel like disrespect. To Parliament, it was the price of consent. Religion sharpened every disagreement. England was officially Protestant, but Protestantism itself was divided. Some wanted the Church of England protected as it was. Puritans wanted it purified of ceremonies they saw as too Catholic. Catholics wanted relief from persecution. Kings wanted religious order because religious disorder threatened political order. But any royal decision in religion could be interpreted as evidence of hidden tyranny. This was why suspicion became so dangerous. A ceremony, a marriage, a bishop, a tax, or a foreign alliance could become proof of a larger design. The Stuarts often thought they were defending monarchy. Their critics thought they were building absolutism. The contrast became fatal. The crown demanded trust, but its subjects demanded guarantees. Under James, the system strained but did not break. He argued, offended, compromised, retreated, and survived. He could be arrogant, but he was also cautious. He understood enough about danger to avoid turning every disagreement into a final test of authority. His son would not be so careful. The doctrine of divine right gave the Stuarts confidence, but it also made compromise feel like surrender. If a king ruled by God's authority, how far could he bend before he betrayed the crown itself? If Parliament could force the king's hand, was monarchy still sacred? If subjects could resist one policy, could they eventually resist the king? These questions did not remain theoretical. They passed from books and speeches into tax disputes, religious reforms, arrests, protests, and finally war. The tragedy of the Stuarts was that they saw themselves as defenders of order in an age that increasingly feared unchecked power. They believed they were preserving the crown. But with every argument over authority, they helped create the opposition that would one day cut that crown from a king's head. When James died, the throne passed to Charles I, a ruler who inherited his father's belief in sacred monarchy, but lacked his father's instinct for retreat. Charles I inherited a throne, a theory of kingship, and a kingdom already suspicious of both. He was not born to be a revolutionary figure. In appearance and temperament, Charles seemed made for dignity rather than chaos. He was reserved, formal, deeply conscious of ceremony, and convinced that monarchy required distance from ordinary political quarrels. Where his father James had argued loudly for royal authority, Charles embodied it quietly. He believed kingship was sacred not because it was useful, but because it was ordained. That belief made him principled. It also made him dangerous. Charles came to the throne in 1625 with many of the same problems his father had faced: money, religion, parliament, and distrust. But Charles had less patience for political negotiation. He wanted respect before compromise, obedience before explanation, and loyalty before consent. To his supporters, this was royal dignity. To his opponents, it looked like the beginning of tyranny. His marriage made suspicion worse. Charles married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess. In dynastic terms, the match was prestigious. In Protestant England, it was alarming. The Queen's faith became more than a private matter. To many, it suggested foreign influence, Catholic sympathy, and the possibility that the Stuart court was drifting away from the Protestant identity of the nation. Every royal decision now carried a shadow. Charles needed money for war and government, but Parliament did not trust him enough to grant it freely. When members challenged his policies, Charles saw insolence. When Charles demanded funds, Parliament saw danger. The relationship became a contest of pride disguised as constitutional debate. The king turned to forced loans and other unpopular financial measures. Those who resisted could be imprisoned. Parliament responded with the Petition of Right in 1628, demanding limits on arbitrary taxation and imprisonment. Charles accepted it, but not in spirit. He had no intention of allowing Parliament to become the master of monarchy. Then came the decision that defined his early reign. In 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament and began what his enemies would later call the personal rule. For 11 years he governed without calling Parliament. To his defenders, this was legal and necessary. England was not in constant parliamentary session by nature, and the king was simply using his rightful authority. To his critics, it was proof that Charles wanted to rule alone. The country did not explode immediately. In some ways, the personal rule looked stable. There was peace, the court was elegant, royal government functioned. But beneath the surface, resentment deepened. Charles raised money through methods like ship money, extending old financial claims in ways many believed unlawful. He promoted religious policies associated with Archbishop William Laud, whose ceremonies and reforms looked to Puritans like a return toward Catholicism. Again, the contrast became deadly. What Charles saw as order, beauty, and sacred worship, many Protestants saw as corruption, idolatry, and betrayal. The king's greatest weakness was not that he had no intelligence, it was that he confused resistance with rebellion. He struggled to see that some of his subjects opposed him because they feared for the law and religion, not because they hated monarchy itself. By treating criticism as disloyalty, he turned anxious subjects into determined opponents. Scotland broke the illusion of control. When Charles tried to impose religious reforms there, resistance erupted. The bishops' wars forced him to do what he had avoided for 11 years, call Parliament, because war required money, but Parliament returned with memory, anger, and demands. The Long Parliament did not simply want to fund the king. It wanted to prevent another personal rule. It attacked royal ministers, challenged religious policy, and demanded structural limits. Charles saw his authority being dismantled piece by piece. Parliament saw itself rescuing the kingdom from arbitrary government. Neither side trusted the other enough to stop. Charles still believed that, in the end, royal authority would command obedience, but his refusal to bend had changed the nature of the conflict. What began as disputes over taxes and worship had become a question of survival. Could the king rule without limits, or could Parliament restrain the crown? Soon, England would discover that when words failed, both sides were willing to raise armies. Civil war begins when a country stops believing that its disputes can be settled by words. By 1642, England had reached that point. Years of suspicion between Charles I and Parliament had hardened into something more dangerous than disagreement. Each side believed the other was threatening the kingdom itself. The king believed Parliament was tearing down lawful monarchy. Parliament believed the king was preparing to destroy liberty, Protestant religion, and the ancient rights of English subjects. Neither side thought it was betraying England. Both claimed to be saving it. That was what made the conflict so devastating. The English Civil War was not simply a battle between a king and a few rebellious politicians. It divided families, towns, counties, churches, and consciences. Some men followed Charles because they believed loyalty to the king was loyalty to God, order, and tradition. Others stood with Parliament because they believed obedience to a king could not mean surrendering law, faith, and freedom. The war forced people to answer a question most had never wanted to face. When the king and the kingdom seemed to stand apart, which one deserves loyalty? The royalists rallied around the crown. They drew support from many nobles, traditionalists, rural communities, and those who feared that Parliament's challenge would unleash disorder. To them, Charles was not a tyrant, but an anointed monarch defending the structure of society against men who wanted to pull it apart. Parliament's supporters saw the opposite. They believed the king had abused trust, governed without consent, corrupted religion, and endangered the Protestant nation. They did not all begin as republicans. Many still wanted monarchy, but a monarchy restrained by law. Yet war has a way of radicalizing those who enter it with limited aims. At first, Charles had reasons for confidence. He possessed royal prestige, experienced commanders, and the emotional power of ancient loyalty. The sight of the royal standard still mattered. The king's name still stirred hearts. Many believed Parliament could complain, but not truly defeat the crown. But the war changed the meaning of power. Parliament learned to organize. It raised money, built networks of supply, and eventually created the new model army, a disciplined military force shaped not only by command, but by conviction. Among its rising figures was Oliver Cromwell, a man whose religious intensity and military ability would become central to the king's destruction. Cromwell and men like him did not fight merely for political adjustment. They increasingly believed they were instruments of providence in a struggle against corruption. This gave Parliament's army a different character. It was not just an army of necessity. It became an army with a cause. Charles, meanwhile, remained trapped by the same flaw that had brought him to war. He could negotiate, but rarely with the trust required to make negotiation last. He could make promises, but his enemies doubted whether he would honor them once power returned. To his supporters, this was caution in defense of monarchy. To his opponents, it was proof that the king could never be trusted. The war dragged on through sieges, battles, raids, and negotiations. It was fought not in distant colonies or foreign fields, but across the king's own realms. English soil became the battlefield of English identity. Every victory deepened the wound. Every defeat hardened the fear. The sacred distance between ruler and subject vanished in the smoke of cannon fire. The monarchy was not yet destroyed, but something just as important had already been broken. Once subjects had taken up arms against their king, the old image of unquestioned kingship could never fully recover. The crown had become a side in a war, not the final authority above it. Charles was defeated, captured, and given chances to settle. But even in captivity, he remained convinced that time, division, and royal legitimacy might restore him. He negotiated with different factions, tried to exploit their rivalries, and looked for a path back to authority. Instead, he convinced his enemies that peace was impossible while he lived as king. The war had begun with Parliament trying to restrain the crown. It ended with soldiers and politicians asking a far more terrifying question: if a king brings war upon his people, can the people judge the king? The answer would lead Charles from battlefield defeat to a public trial, and from trial to a scaffold. The execution of Charles I was not only the death of a king, it was the moment the sacred body of monarchy was dragged into the world of human judgment. After years of war, defeat, captivity, and failed negotiation, Charles still believed the crown gave him a protection no court could remove. He had lost armies, cities, and political allies, but he had not surrendered the central belief of his life that a lawful king answered to God, not to subjects who had rebelled against him. His enemies had reached the opposite conclusion. To them, Charles was not a martyr in waiting. He was the author of bloodshed, the man whose duplicity had made peace impossible, and the ruler who would plunge the kingdom back into war if he were restored without limits. Parliament had once fought to restrain him. The army now moved beyond restraint. It wanted judgment. In January 1649, Charles was brought before a specially created court in Westminster Hall. The setting mattered. This was not a private assassination or a palace coup hidden behind doors. It was law, or at least the language of law, placed against royalty in public view. The charge was treason against the people of England. For generations, treason had meant betrayal of the king. Now the meaning was reversed. A king was being accused of betraying the nation. Charles refused to recognize the court. He asked by what authority he had been brought there. It was not simply a legal tactic. It was the last defense of divine monarchy. If the court had no authority over him, then the trial was illegitimate. If it did, then kingship itself had changed forever. The judges pressed forward. The king remained defiant. His silence and refusal gave his supporters an image they would preserve for centuries: a dignified monarch surrounded by rebels, standing above the court that claimed to condemn him. To his enemies, the same behavior proved his arrogance. Even defeated, he would not accept that the people had any authority over the crown. This was the cruel contrast of Charles's final days. In life, his stubbornness had helped destroy peace. In defeat, that same stubbornness gave him tragic grandeur. On the 30th of January 1649, Charles walked to the scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. The place was heavy with symbolism. He passed from a royal palace to a public platform, from majesty to mortality. A cold crowd waited. Soldiers guarded the scene. The executioners wore masks. The king wore extra clothing so that his shivering would not be mistaken for fear. Before he died, Charles presented himself as a defender of law and liberty, not their enemy. He claimed that true freedom did not mean subjects sharing government, but living under established law. It was a final attempt to define the conflict on his own terms. He had lost the war, but he would not surrender the meaning of his reign. Then the axe fell. For a moment, England stood in a silence that seemed impossible. The anointed king was dead. The body that had once represented sacred order lay separated from the power it had claimed. Some saw justice. Others saw murder. Some believed the nation had been freed from tyranny. Others believed it had committed a sin that would haunt it. The monarchy was abolished. The House of Lords was removed. England became a commonwealth, then a republic dominated by soldiers, parliament, and eventually Oliver Cromwell. The Stuart heir, Charles II, was a king in name only, pushed into exile and dependence. Yet the execution did not destroy the Stuarts as completely as their enemies hoped. It gave the family something dangerous: martyrdom. Charles I became, for royalists, the murdered father of the nation, a symbol of loyalty, suffering, and sacred kingship betrayed. His death wounded monarchy, but also made monarchy emotionally powerful again for those horrified by revolution. The crown had fallen, but the longing for it had not disappeared entirely from the nation after all. And while England tried to live without a king, the surviving Stuarts waited across the water, learning that defeat could become memory, and memory could become a path back to power one day. A dynasty can survive defeat if enough people grow tired of the world that replaced it. After the execution of Charles I, the Stuarts seemed finished. Their king was dead, their throne abolished, and their heir forced into exile. England had done what many Europeans believed impossible. It had killed an anointed monarch, and tried to build a government without kings. For the young Charles II, the crown was now more memory than power. He wandered through foreign courts with a title that sounded grand but meant little. In royalist circles, he was still king. In terms, he was a dependent exile, relying on allies' promises and the shifting interests of France, the Dutch Republic, and powers. His cause carried romance, but romance did not pay armies or secure kingdoms. Meanwhile, England entered its republican experiment. At first, it called itself a commonwealth ruled in the name of the people and parliament. But the new order was born from war, and war had given enormous power to the army. Oliver Cromwell, once a country gentleman and cavalry commander, rose to become the central figure of the regime. To his supporters, he was a godly reformer who had rescued England from tyranny. To his enemies, he was a king in all but name, ruling through soldiers while pretending monarchy had been defeated. This was the contradiction that helped the Stuarts survive. The Republic had destroyed the king, but it struggled to replace the emotional and symbolic power of kingship. It could win battles. It could enforce order. It could govern through councils, parliaments, ordinances, and military authority. But it could not easily make itself loved. England had not become a peaceful republic of shared consent. It had become a nation watched by generals, divided by religion, and exhausted by revolution. For many people, the question changed. It was no longer whether Charles I had made mistakes. It was whether life without monarchy had brought the stability they had hoped for. Charles II understood waiting better than fighting. He made attempts to reclaim power, but he also learned patience. Exile taught him caution in a way his father had never mastered. He saw how fragile loyalty could be, how quickly promises vanished, and how dangerous it was for a king to mistake desire for reality. If he returned, he would need more than blood. He would need invitation. Cromwell's death in 1658 opened the door. His son Richard could not command the army or the nation with the same authority. The republican system, strained, began to fracture. Soldiers, politicians, and former royalists maneuvered in confusion. No settlement seemed strong enough to hold. England, which had once feared the return of royal tyranny, now feared instability. Into this uncertainty stepped General George Monk. Moving from Scotland into England, he became the force behind the restoration of order. The political nation began to accept what had once seemed impossible. Bringing back the Stuarts might be the least dangerous option. Charles II issued the Declaration of Breda in 1660, promising pardon, religious moderation, respect for property, and cooperation with Parliament. It was a careful document, written for a tired country. It did not sound like revenge. It sounded like relief. When Charles returned to England, the welcome was extraordinary. Crowds celebrated, bells rang, London dressed itself in joy. The monarchy was restored, and with it came theatre, ceremony, colour, and the feeling that the long nightmare of civil war and military rule had ended. But beneath the celebration was a hard political truth. Charles II did not return because divine right had conquered Parliament. He returned because enough powerful people decided monarchy was useful again. The crown had been restored by consent, exhaustion, calculation, and memory. That made the restoration both triumphant and limited. Charles came back smiling, but he came back to a throne transformed by his father's death. He knew the axe at Whitehall was not ancient history. It was a warning. A Stuart king could reign again, but only if he understood what the scaffold had taught. Kings who pushed too far could fall. His father had died defending sacred monarchy. Charles II would survive by making monarchy flexible, charming, and evasive. Charles II returned to a kingdom that wanted celebration, but he never forgot that celebration could turn into judgment. To the public, he became the merry monarch. After years of civil war, Puritan rule, military discipline, and political exhaustion, his court seemed to breathe colour back into England. Theatres reopened, music returned. Fashion, wit, mistresses, gambling, and laughter surrounded the restored king. Charles was charming where his father had been stiff, approachable where his father had been severe, and worldly where the Republic had been austere. But the image was only half the truth. Behind the pleasure was a survivor. Charles had lived through his father's execution, his own exile, failed military hopes, poverty, dependence, and humiliation. He had seen monarchy destroyed not in theory, but in blood. He understood that a crown could be restored and still remain fragile. The smile, the charm, and the easy manners were not just personality. They were political tools. Charles knew how to bend. This made him very different from Charles I. His father had treated compromise as a threat to royal dignity. Charles II treated compromise as a way to keep the throne. He could retreat without looking defeated, promise without surrendering everything, and wait while his enemies exposed their own divisions. To admirers, he was clever and humane. To critics, he was slippery, immoral, and unprincipled. Both views contained truth. The Restoration settlement gave England its monarchy back, but not in its old sacred form. Parliament remained essential. Money remained a problem. Religion remained explosive. Memories of civil war shaped every political argument. The country wanted order, but it did not want a king who would drag it back toward absolutism. Charles had to rule in the shadow of the scaffold. His personal life added glamour and scandal to the Stuart story. He had many mistresses and many illegitimate children, but no legitimate heir. At court, this produced gossip, rivalry, and influence. For the dynasty, it created danger. A king without a legitimate child left the succession to his brother James, an openly Catholic figure in a Protestant kingdom. Every royal pleasure therefore carried a political cost. The king's private life was never merely private. The reign also faced disasters that tested the restored monarchy. In 1665, plague struck London with terrifying force. The following year, the Great Fire consumed much of the city. These catastrophes could have damaged the aura of the new regime. Yet they also allowed the crown and government to present themselves as forces of rebuilding and order. London rose again, but the disasters reminded everyone how thin the line was between stability and chaos. Foreign policy brought further tensions. Wars with the Dutch, rivalry with France, and secret diplomacy made Parliament suspicious of the king's intentions. Charles admired aspects of French monarchy, where Louis XIV ruled with a splendor and authority no English king could easily match. To some English Protestants, this admiration looked dangerous. France meant Catholic power, royal absolutism, and the nightmare of a king who answered to no parliament. Religion remained the deepest wound. Charles preferred flexibility and disliked persecution, but he ruled a nation where religious tolerance could be interpreted as Catholic conspiracy. The popish plot hysteria of the late 1670s revealed how quickly fear could become political weaponry. False accusations of a Catholic plot to murder the king and place James on the throne created panic, executions, and a fierce campaign to exclude James from succession. Here Charles showed his survival instinct again. He protected his brother's claim while avoiding the collapse of his own authority. He dissolved parliaments when necessary, managed factions, and died in 1685, still in possession of the crown. His reign did not solve the Stuart problem. It postponed it. Charles II kept the monarchy alive by understanding the price of survival. He allowed the crown to sparkle, but he never forgot the blood beneath the gold. He made kingship charming, adaptable, and human, yet he left behind the same unresolved question that had haunted his family for generations. Could a Catholic Stuart rule a Protestant kingdom? His brother James would answer that question badly and turn old suspicion into open political crisis almost overnight for Britain. James II inherited the throne with the confidence of a lawful king and the burden of a faith his kingdom feared. When Charles II died in 1685, the succession passed smoothly to his brother James. On paper, this should have been a moment of stability. James was not a foreign invader or a distant claimant. He was the king's brother, an experienced soldier, a man of royal blood, and the legitimate heir. Many people who disliked his Catholicism still accepted the principle of hereditary succession. After civil war, execution, republic, and restoration, England had learned to fear disorder. At first, James benefited from that fear. Rebellions against him failed quickly. The most famous came from the Duke of Monmouth, Charles II's illegitimate Protestant son, who tried to present himself as an alternative to a Catholic king. Monmouth's rising collapsed, and the punishment that followed was brutal. The bloody assizes, led by Judge Jeffreys, created an image of royal vengeance that clung to the new reign. To supporters, James had defended lawful monarchy against rebellion. To critics, he had revealed the hard edge of Stuart power. The deeper problem was not that James was Catholic. It was that many Protestants believed his Catholicism came with a political program. 17th century England did not see religion as private identity. Faith was tied to loyalty, law, foreign policy, and national survival. Catholic monarchy reminded many English Protestants of France, Louis XIV persecution, standing armies, and royal absolutism. A Catholic king was not simply a man attending a different church. In the imagination of his enemies, he was the doorway through which foreign tyranny and religious oppression might enter the kingdom. James did little to calm those fears. He wanted religious toleration for Catholics and Protestant dissenters, and in another age that might have been remembered as enlightened. But context changed everything. When James suspended laws against Catholics, promoted Catholic officers, challenged Anglican institutions, and used royal authority to reshape public life, many subjects saw not toleration, but manipulation. What James called liberty of conscience, they called a weapon against the Protestant state. Once again, the Stuart contrast became fatal. Reform to one side looked like control to the other. James also relied on a standing army, alarming those who remembered that armies had once ruled England after the Civil War. He placed trusted Catholics in positions of influence, angering elites who saw the established church and political order being pushed aside. He clashed with bishops, universities, and local authorities. Each decision might be defended separately. Together, they formed a pattern that his enemies believed they understood too well. The birth of a son in 1688 turned anxiety into panic. Before that moment, many opponents of James had waited. His daughters Mary and Anne were Protestant, and Mary was married to William of Orange, a leading Protestant prince in Europe. If James died without a male heir, the crown would pass back into Protestant hands. Time, not rebellion, might solve the problem. But the birth of James Francis Edward Stuart changed the future. Now there was the possibility of a Catholic Stuart dynasty, not merely a Catholic Stuart king. Rumours spread almost instantly, including the claim that the baby had been smuggled into the Queen's chamber in a warming pan. The story was absurd, But its popularity revealed something more important than truth. Trust in James had collapsed. A king can survive criticism. He can survive unpopularity. But he cannot easily survive when the political nation stops believing him. James saw himself as defending monarchy, conscience, and legitimate succession. His enemies saw him as repeating the oldest Stuart mistake, confusing the crown's legal right with the country's willingness to obey. He had royal blood but not public confidence. He had authority but not trust. By 1688, leading English figures were no longer asking whether James should be advised, restrained, or endured. They were asking whether the Protestant future of the kingdom required his removal, and this time they would not put a king on trial. They would invite another ruler to take his place, and call the transfer not rebellion, but the rescue of nation, faith, and law from a king they no longer trusted. The Stuarts lost the crown most decisively when England discovered it could remove a king without destroying monarchy itself. In 1688, the crisis around James II reached the point where patience seemed more dangerous than action. To many Protestant elites, the birth of his Catholic son meant that the problem would not end with James's death. A Catholic dynasty might now continue for generations. The fear was no longer temporary misgovernment. It was permanent transformation. So a group of leading English politicians made a choice that would have been treason in one language and patriotism in another. They invited William of Orange, the Dutch Protestant prince married to James's daughter Mary, to come to England with an army. William was not merely a husband with a family claim. He was one of Europe's most important Protestant leaders, locked in a wider struggle against Catholic France and Louis XIV. To his English supporters, he represented rescue, Protestantism, Parliament, law, and international security. To James, he represented invasion, betrayal, and the collapse of natural loyalty. This was the cruelest part of the Glorious Revolution. James was not overthrown only by strangers. He was abandoned by the political class, by officers, by nobles, and finally by members of his own family. His daughter Mary became central to the settlement that removed him. His younger daughter Anne also shifted away from him. The crisis was political, religious, and deeply personal. When William landed in England, James still had an army. He still had a legal claim. He still wore the crown. But power is not only law. Power is confidence, obedience, and belief. As support drained away, James found himself surrounded by the empty shell of kingship. Men who had sworn loyalty hesitated. Commanders defected. The old Stuart problem returned in its sharpest form. Royal blood could place a man on the throne, but it could not force a frightened nation to trust him. James fled. That flight gave Parliament the language it needed. Rather than declare bluntly that they had deposed a lawful king, they argued that James had abandoned the government. The throne was treated as vacant, not because monarchy had ended, but because James had failed the conditions of rule. It was a legal fiction, but a powerful one. It allowed England to change kings while claiming to preserve order. William and Mary were offered the crown together. This mattered enormously. The monarchy was no longer passing by simple hereditary right alone. It was being granted through a political settlement. Parliament was not merely recognizing bloodline, it was choosing terms. The Bill of Rights in 1689 made those terms clearer. The monarch could not suspend laws at will. Taxation required parliamentary authority. Standing armies in peacetime needed consent. Parliamentary elections and debates required protection. The settlement did not create modern democracy, but it changed the balance of power permanently. The crown survived, but it survived by accepting limits. For the Stuarts, this was a defeat deeper than exile. Charles I had lost his life. James II lost the argument his family had been making for generations. The Glorious Revolution was called glorious partly because, compared with civil war and regicide, it seemed orderly and restrained. But beneath that polished name was a radical transformation. A king had been removed because enough powerful people decided he had become unacceptable. The crown had been transferred not by divine mystery, but by political judgment. To supporters, this was the salvation of Protestant liberty. To Jacobites, it was betrayal dressed in law. To later generations, it became one of the foundations of constitutional monarchy. The Stuarts had always believed that inheritance was the heart of kingship. After 1688, Britain moved toward a different idea. Monarchy could continue, but only under conditions set by law, parliament, and national trust. James crossed the sea into exile, but he did not take the Stuart dream with him entirely. One final Stuart monarch would still sit on the British throne. Yet Queen Anne would inherit a crown already transformed by revolution, and a dynasty already running out of future. Queen Anne inherited the Stuart crown after revolution had already changed what a crown could mean. When she came to the throne in 1702, Anne was not a ruler standing above a settled dynasty. She was the last surviving Protestant Stuart with a realistic claim accepted by Parliament. Behind her stood decades of civil war, regicide, restoration, Catholic fear, and the overthrow of her own father, James II. The monarchy she inherited still glittered with ceremony, but its foundations had been rebuilt by law. Anne was a Stuart, but she ruled in a post-Stuart world. Her reign began with war abroad and uncertainty at home. Europe was consumed by the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict over inheritance, balance of power, and the danger that France might dominate the continent. Britain, under Anne, became part of a grand alliance against Louis IV, and victories under the Duke of Marlborough gave her reign military glory, and Britain's place in Europe grew stronger. Publicly, this was a reign of national confidence. Privately, it was marked by grief. Anne's personal life was one of the saddest in royal history. She endured pregnancy after pregnancy, but none of her children survived to inherit the throne. The most painful loss was her son William, Duke of Gloucester, who died in 1700 at the age of 11. His death did more than break a mother's heart. It created a dynastic emergency. Without a surviving Protestant Stuart heir, the question of succession became urgent. This was the cruel contrast of Anne's reign. The nation was becoming stronger while the dynasty was dying. Parliament had already acted to prevent the return of Catholic Stuarts. The Act of Settlement in 1701 directed the succession toward Sophia of Hanover and her Protestant descendants. This meant that after Anne, the crown would leave the direct Stuart line and pass to a German Protestant house. Blood still mattered, but religion and parliamentary approval mattered more. The old Stuart principle of hereditary right had been permanently subordinated to political necessity. Anne accepted this world, but she did not create it. She was both monarch and symbol of transition. Under her, the crown remained visible, dignified, and emotionally important. Yet the machinery of government increasingly depended on ministers, parties, parliament, finance, and war administration. The age of personal monarchy was fading. The age of constitutional monarchy was taking shape. The greatest political achievement of Anne's reign was the Act of Union in 1707. England and Scotland, long joined by one monarch, but separate as kingdoms, became the Kingdom of Great Britain. In one sense, this fulfilled the dream James V and I had imagined a century earlier, a united British state under one crown. In another sense, it exposed the irony of Stuart history. The dynasty that had struggled to unite crowns, churches, parliaments, and peoples finally presided over union at the very moment its own future was ending. Union brought opportunity, empire, trade, and a stronger British state. But it also carried tension, resentment, negotiation, and compromise. Scotland did not simply vanish into England. England did not simply absorb an obedient partner. The Union was a political bargain shaped by debt, security, religion, succession, and ambition. It was not romance. It was statecraft. Anne's court also reflected the changing nature of power. Her relationships with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and later Abigail Masham became politically charged, tied to Whig and Tory rivalries. Personal friendship, party politics, royal favour, and national policy blended together. Even the Queen's private affections could become instruments in a struggle for influence. By the end of her life, Anne was isolated, ill, and childless. Around her, politicians prepared for the Hanoverian succession. The exiled Stuarts still had supporters, but the official state had chosen Protestant security over direct bloodline. When Anne died in 1714, the Stuart monarchy in Britain died with her. She left behind a stronger kingdom, but an extinct ruling line. Her reign created Great Britain, yet ended the family that had once dreamed of ruling it by sacred inheritance. The crown passed to Hanover, but the Stuart story was not over. Across the water, exiled heirs still claimed that Britain had chosen convenience over legitimacy. The Stuarts lost the throne, but they did not immediately lose the loyalty of everyone who believed blood mattered more than Parliament. When Queen Anne died in 1714, the British crown passed to George I of Hanover, a Protestant German prince chosen because law, religion, and political security now outweighed the claims of the direct Stuart line. To the new British state, this was settled succession. To Jacobites, it was theft. They believed the rightful king was James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of James II, remembered by supporters as James III and by enemies as the Old Pretender. The Jacobite cause was built on a powerful contradiction. It looked backward to hereditary right, sacred monarchy, and loyalty to the exiled Stuarts. But it survived because the new Britain was not yet emotionally settled. Many people disliked the Hanoverians. Some resented the union of England and Scotland. Some remained Catholic. Others were Protestant, but still believed that removing the rightful line had corrupted the monarchy. Jacobitism became more than politics. It became memory, faith, identity, and longing. The first major rising came in 1715. Supporters of James tried to restore the Stuarts after Anne's death, but the rebellion lacked timing, unity, and decisive leadership. It failed. James arrived too late, inspired too little confidence, and returned to exile. The Stuart dream survived, but it had already shown its weakness. Romance could gather men, but it could not easily build a modern state. Still, the myth remained alive. For decades, Jacobite hopes moved through courts, taverns, Highland clans, Catholic families, secret networks, and foreign diplomacy. France and Spain sometimes saw the exiled Stuarts as useful weapons against Britain. For supporters, the cause was noble loyalty. For the British government, it was treason backed by foreign enemies. Then came the most famous attempt of all. In 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, the son of James Francis Edward, landed in Scotland. History would remember him as Bonnie Prince Charlie. Young, charismatic, and wrapped in the romance of lost kingship, he gave the Jacobite cause a face that his father never had. He raised his standard in the Highlands and gathered clans willing to fight for the restoration of the Stuart line. At first, the rising seemed almost miraculous. Edinburgh fell. Jacobite forces won at Prestonpans. Charles marched into England, carrying the dream of Stuart restoration farther than many thought possible. For a moment, it seemed the exiled dynasty might return not as memory, but as power. But hope is not the same as strength. The Jacobite army lacked broad English support, secure supplies, and clear strategic certainty. Many in England did not rise for Charles. The movement that felt romantic in the Highlands looked dangerous elsewhere, Catholic, foreign-backed, uncertain, and tied to a political world Britain had already rejected. The march turned back, momentum faded. In 1746 at Culloden, the dream collapsed. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Government forces crushed the Jacobite army. Highland society suffered devastating reprisals. Charles escaped, becoming a fugitive legend, but the cause he embodied was broken. After Culloden, the Stuarts became less a political future than a cultural memory. Songs, stories, symbols, and nostalgia kept them alive. Bonnie Prince Charlie became romanticized as the lost prince across the water. The Jacobites became figures of loyalty and sacrifice, but the British state moved on. The Hanoverian monarchy survived. Parliament grew stronger. Empire expanded. The old Stuart claim became increasingly impossible. This was the final contrast of the dynasty. They lost reality, but gained legend. The Stuarts had once ruled through crowns, parliaments, marriages, armies, and laws. In exile, they ruled only imagination. Their supporters remembered legitimacy. Their enemies remembered civil war, Catholic fear, and the danger of returning to the past. Both memories were powerful, but only one could shape the future. The Jacobites proved that the Stuarts were not forgotten. They also proved that Britain had changed too much to take them back. Their failure marked the final defeat of divine hereditary monarchy as a practical force in Britain. After them, the crown could still inspire loyalty, ceremony, and emotion, but it would never again stand above Parliament in the old Stuart way or command the nation. The Stuarts lost Britain because they never understood that monarchy had changed. They were not a minor family destroyed by weakness. They produced queens of legend, courageous kings, and rebels of extraordinary loyalty. The United Crowns survived execution, restored monarchy, and gave their name to the most dramatic chapters in British history. Yet again and again they confused inheritance with security. Mary, Queen of Scots, discovered that royal blood could make a woman powerful enough to fear and isolated enough to destroy. Charles, I believed sacred kingship could stand above Parliament, and died beneath an executioner's axe. Charles II survived because he learned caution. James II fell because he forgot it. Queen Anne left Britain stronger, but the Stuart line exhausted. The Jacobites kept the dream alive, but dreams could not reverse a constitutional age. Their tragedy was not that they lacked crowns, it was that they mistook crowns for trust. By the end, Britain had not rejected monarchy itself, it had rejected monarchy without limits. The Stuarts tried to rule as sacred sovereigns in a country learning to demand consent. Were they victims of a changing age, or did they lose Britain because they refused to change with it?